Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar presented by Ziflow. My name is Mike Peterbaugh, and I'll be one of your hosts for today's webinar on creative production benchmarks. We have just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. We have muted attendee lines, and that's just to cut down on background noise, but we do want questions. So please enter them at any time via the Q&A interface in Zoom, and we'll take them at the end of today's presentation. And lastly, yes, our session today is being recorded and a copy will be sent out right after we finish up today. With that, let's meet our hosts. As I mentioned, my name is Mike Peterbaugh, and I'm the CMO here at Ziflow. I'm joined today by Will Liu, our VP of Operation, who heads up our customer success team and strategy. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ziflow, we're the leading innovator in the online proofing space, helping agencies and brands worldwide solve their most pressing review and approval challenges. If this is something you and your team are looking for help with, you can find more information on our website at www.ziflow.com. Okay, let's get into today's discussion. Over the last few years, we've processed over 3 million proofs, and that's across a pretty wide range of media types. And we're kind of data nerds here at Ziflow. Well, actually, we're huge data nerds. So we decided to crack open Excel and look at some raw data to come up with a picture of what those 3 million proofs look like and how online proofing impacted creative operations. So we'll be looking at version counts and what drives version counts, the benefits of taking a workflow approach to your projects. We'll also talk about workflow a little bit more for those of you who aren't familiar. And we'll also look at the number of stakeholders and how that can affect your timelines, but maybe not as severely as you might think. So let's get into it. First, we wanted to set a baseline of what types of projects that have been run through Ziflow over the last few years. Which we've ranked here by a raw, basically a count approach. Static media files, such as the good old PDF and JPEG files, and video files make up over 90% of projects completed within Ziflow. Web projects, both live and static captures, while not huge contributors to the overall counts, have some interesting data associated with them, which we'll cover a little bit later in this presentation. Will, I don't think anyone is particularly surprised that PDFs and static design files would be the most common project types, but I know you have some thoughts about video coming in at a kind of a respectable second place.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things to me is actually the just number of different video types that we're seeing. Traditionally, video is always going to be dominated by the standards H.263, H.264, but what we're actually seeing as we dive into the video number is just the number of different codecs that our videos are getting proofed in nowadays compared to just having everything as H.264 wrapped in MP4. I think what that's really pointing to is this explosion of different video types or different video codecs is really pointing to how there are just so many more marketing channels today than there were even a couple of years ago. So now video content is coming out. Video content needs to be produced for a number of different channels with a number of different standards and optimization. So we're really seeing that explosion on just the different video types that are getting proofed through the system.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I always think about when I look at like video and even audio coming in at number 6, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is often our customers are using Ziflow as like an abstraction layer. It's very easy for them to upload, as Will mentioned, literally the 100 different types of codecs required to render and share video files. Ziflow effectively becomes an abstraction layer for that, allowing you to share out hundreds, over 1,000 video types, in fact, with team members pretty easily. So I think that definitely is something that is kind of an added value point for maybe not just Ziflow itself, but really an online proofing system that has that capability to manage and provide and support that many codecs. So now that we've set that kind of baseline, let's look at some benchmarks that start to set the tone for output. And the first version, or the first benchmark, I should say, that we're going to look at is versions to completion. Creative projects reviewed in Ziflow require an average of 2.18 versions to completion. And this number blew me away actually for a couple of reasons when Will first shared it as part of the research output. I'd say mainly because we use Ziflow all day, every day, internally here at Ziflow. We use it so much. Obviously, we actually did a webinar on how Ziflow uses Ziflow. And most of our projects, I can tell you within the marketing department anyway, go far beyond 2 versions. So to see the overall average slightly above 2 really surprised, and quite frankly, it impressed me, I guess is the best way of putting it. And I think this is even more impressive to me when I consider, the kind of the polling and surveying we do of our customers during onboarding, is that our customers tell us that, before deploying Ziflow, they've typically required between 4 and 6 versions for their projects. And that's kind of an aggregate, and I would say I'd probably chalk that up to an anecdotal number. But I also think that's just a really, really impressive number. And like I said, one that was kind of surprising. Let's actually jump into and look at the raw data. So this is the raw view of the version data across all the different, well, really for all 3 million proofs in our system. Both web forms, static and live web captures, require more than average version counts, which I also found interesting. And we're going to talk a little bit more about web capture a bit more in our next benchmark. And we'll be coming back to this, and actually I kind of expand on this slide a little bit later to show even more data and context. But I think it's an interesting format when it comes to benchmark data, the web formats, both live and static. I mentioned before that version count was probably my biggest surprise discovered during this research. And I want to share a few reasons why we think this is the case within Ziflow. So, and really, I say within Ziflow, but, really I'm talking about online proofing too, really as a category. First and foremost, so how does online proofing help reduce version counts? And first and foremost, I'd point to precision feedback, the ability to mark up a creative asset regardless of the format, and on the asset itself, provide that feedback. And this is where you start to avoid ambiguity, and it cuts down on rework significantly. For example, feedback that used to drive designers crazy, like move it a little bit to the left. Who's left? How far? Make the logo a little bit bigger. That type of feedback is largely avoided now because reviewers can be very ultra specific and precise. And I think that has a lot of ramifications in the number of versions required. And we'll kind of come back to this theme and concept a little bit later as we look at all of the numbers kind of in context together. And what if comments aren't that specific? Well, kind of going on to the next point, I think commenting that allows for true collaboration and not just notes is really beneficial. So replies and threaded comments become absolutely key. I think this really helps refine change requests and also allows team members who maybe jump in late to the process, they can be brought up to speed very quickly by looking at the comments, seeing which comments were already made, seeing which maybe suggestions were already either kind of, deprioritized or maybe deferred. It allows them to get brought up to speed pretty quickly. And lastly, I'd say, kind of staying on that commenting theme, I would say that enhanced commenting, being able to label comments and mark them as done or resolved, I think that further streamlines the process and again, cuts down on the number of versions required. Will, you've got a lot of experience with this and working with our customers and on some of our larger scale projects too. Is there anything here you want to add about maybe why you think online proofing specifically has a positive effect, a net positive effect on reduced versions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you touched on the major points, right, Mike? Precise feedback drives action, collaboration via real-time commenting, and enhanced commenting. I think one of the top benefits where people are really seeing that reduction in versions is also just online proofing makes it a lot clearer on when you should create a new version. As we go through the implementation process with our customers, one of the top questions that I always get is, when should we make a new version? Like, when should we say that we should action on this feedback and create a new version? And without an online proofing platform, without a tool like Ziflow, there's a lot of ambiguity in that. If copy has given you their feedback already, should I go ahead and make my copy changes and then send it to design? Or should design take a look at it first and then I can make my copy and design changes together? And what we're seeing is an online proofing tool, something like Ziflow, makes it a lot clearer on when all the feedback has been captured and when you should actually create that next version. So I think an online proofing tool really does two things. It, one, makes the feedback better, more consistent, and more accurate, but it also provides clarity for the people that are actually doing the work, the designers, the studio teams, the production teams. It provides clarity to them on when they should actually action that feedback, so they're not creating revisions too early or they're not creating revisions incorrectly. And those are really the top things I see drive up the version count, where someone may create a version based off of feedback, but not everyone on the team has had a chance to review it yet. And we see that feed into the workflow number, right, Mike? We see how workflow has sped up turnaround time as well as improved versions. I know I'm getting a little ahead of you here, so and you're gonna touch on that in a bit, but I think for me, the reduced versions can really be chalked to more precise, more accurate feedback, which the commenting tools on an online proofing tool allow you to do, but also provides much more clarity for the teams and for them to understand, okay, we've collected all the feedback we need to, and now we should action those changes. So versions aren't being created prematurely.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Will. I mean, and we are going to get to a couple of other, these supporting points in just a bit. One thing I wanted to do, and this might be remedial for a lot of the people on the call today, but if this is something that you're thinking, well, maybe this is something we should spend a little bit more time thinking about, and maybe trying to optimize within the organization. I just want to go over really quickly why it's important to track version counts as far as how we see it. And this is really based off of conversations with our customers and them telling us the benefits that they're getting back from reduced version counts. If you're tracking versions pretty regularly, it really does help you identify areas for improvement within your overall process. If you've been on our webinars before, you've heard Will say that making changes, positive changes to your workflow and your process has compounding effects over all the projects that you're going to run in the future. And I think that's definitely one area around versions that definitely rings true. So areas for improvement, this most often starts with project scopes and timelines being well defined. It can also determine if workloads and action items are dispersed accurately and clearly and probably efficiently across teams. Also, one of the lagging indicators that you can learn from to improve in the future is to review which projects and or teams, sometimes they're kind of locked together, projects and teams, depending on if you have specialization or subject matter experts, which of those projects and teams run into challenges the most often, either in implementing feedback or even before that, soliciting feedback. So this is either due to incomplete review or poor internal collaboration capabilities. That's a good flag to look for that you can improve upon to cut down on versions. Also, I would point out too is in the agency world, I know that we have quite a few members from the agency world on the call today. It's always beneficial to better understand which clients tend to provide incomplete scope, or they're changing requirements left and right. This often obviously is requiring your team to start all over again and run up version counts, but also not just version counts, but cost. That's something that I think I didn't make necessarily a bright line distinction or connection to, but a lot of times, and maybe many of you are on the call are thinking it already, but many times when you see more versions, one way or another, you can also associate higher costs with that as well. So that's I just wanted to kind of do that little remedial session there. As Will mentioned, we talk with our customers a lot about versions, and we get asked that question a lot. One of the offers we made in a previous webinar, and I kind of like to just extend it now, that if you're interested in doing like a workshop or consultation to find out where in your process maybe you could optimize based on the experience that we have, we'd love to offer that too as a consultation. And I'll give you ways for us to get in touch with us to take advantage of that later in the call. There's a couple of interesting version count outliers, just kind of numbers that maybe kind of popped off the Excel grid that I wanted to share. Interestingly enough, static web captures average the most versions and comments per project. They do well over 3 versions per uh, project on average, but they have 13 comments per project. The average maybe is actually closer to 4. And there's over 4 decisions provided per project. And so these are all kind of outliers. Our thinking, and I would love, your, feedback on this, maybe in the questions, and when we open up the Q&A at the end of the call, I'd love your thinking about maybe why new website projects, or not necessarily new, but why website-related projects require a broader set of stakeholders and often require more refinement than, say, a display ad, for example. I guess that's my thinking, is that maybe it's new website projects. But I should point out that web capture is not just for websites. It's really, we can capture static screenshots or screen grabs, I should say, of URLs, complete page URLs, but also we can do that in a live fashion as well. Traditionally, you're probably thinking about like website pages, maybe new landing pages. But we have, a large set of customers that use Ziflow to proof HTML emails. So, if your email service provider provides a preview link, much like many web content management systems do, an ungated preview link for either landing pages or emails, you can plug those into Ziflow as well. So that may be affecting the number here, but I'd love your thoughts in the comments as to why web projects have way more comments than average. Audio files, on the other end of the spectrum, were by far the least reviewed media type. Their average was basically 1 version, 1 comment, actually less than 1 comment on average per project. I think this highlights the additional value, and Will touched on it a little bit before. The additional value of an online proofing solution that has the ability to render or basically communicate and share over 1,200 media types in a single UI. And this is the point I made earlier. I think many of our customers use Ziflow as a really effective abstraction layer for sharing creative content, since we render practically everything under the sun. And I think that point there is that you don't have to worry about your teammates having the right application to open up a particular file. If you want to share an audio file that's going to accompany a video, or maybe it's a radio spot or a jingle, you can do that pretty easily in Ziflow, in addition to, obviously the more traditional types of creative content. All right, let's get on and start talking about the benefits of applying a workflow approach to your review and approval process. First, some quick context about what we mean here at Ziflow when we talk about workflow. We've actually done a webinar on this subject on itself, actually. So if you're new to this concept, you should definitely check that out. Definitely talk to your Ziflow rep who will be reaching out after this webinar for a link to that webinar. You can also find it on our website, or actually on YouTube too, I believe. When we talk about workflow in the Ziflow context, we're talking about the ability to set up stages, which allow you to separate review cycles for teams or specific stakeholders, and then have those stages be progressed upon by triggers, which can automatically move the project to the next stage based upon some type of predefined decision criteria, such as decisions or time boundaries. And then also a core component to this is automated reminders and notifications to keep the project moving. And workflow in the Ziflow context anyway can be set up on a project basis, or on a project by project basis, but also that we can also automate that. So I wanted to, actually, let's just go to the next slide before I drag Will into this. I wanted to just kind of show you, workflow by the numbers. Again, this is within the projects, across all the projects within Ziflow. So 40% of all Ziflow proof projects utilize workflow, and that's across all media types. That number honestly quite surprised me as well. It's quite a number of projects that are having workflow applied to it. I think that's a function of complex review processes, which we support very, very well. And also probably, and I won't say that this is true, definitely as a rule, but I would say that it probably contributes to it, is that we do have, large customers that have, an agency client type of relationship where they're routing creative internally and externally based on part of their processes. Within that number, a couple of areas jumped out at me. One is video. So 43% of all video projects in Ziflow utilize workflow, and 56% of all live website projects in Ziflow utilize workflow. We're going to jump into those and get specific about maybe some things that are interesting about this. But I wanted to also kind of actually, let's just jump into that again before, and I'll let Will take it from here. But Will, one thing I want to definitely kind of talk about is when workflow makes sense for an organization. I covered it briefly. I mentioned that we've done a webinar just on workflow best practices and collaboration best practices. But obviously with video, there's some benefit. But if you want to talk also about when workflow makes sense for teams, please feel free.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a couple of the really interesting things that we saw as we looked at workflow and the difference that it made for video projects is that with workflow, I think the big thing to point out is there was a 35% reduction in turnaround time for videos that used an automated workflow versus videos that didn't use a workflow at all and just went through a basic workflow. And that came out to 26 days of time saved. What isn't highlighted in this number, a couple of really interesting things that we saw was that the differences really came out when the volume of work was more. As marketers, we all know that there is seasonality. There's going to be certain times of the year where there's just a lot more projects, and we saw a 50%, 70% reduction in turnaround time in really busy months, actually. So the difference between using a workflow and not using a workflow on average through the year was 35%, but there were certain months where the volume of videos were up, or where the volume of videos were higher, and we were seeing that reduction of turnaround time up to 50, 60%. A couple of things that might feel counterintuitive here as we talk about how workflow can make a difference for video projects is video projects utilizing workflow on average actually have a higher number of versions and a larger number of decisions being made on them. So we actually see an increase in the core metrics for video projects using workflows versus not using them. But while there are more versions and more decisions, the turnaround time is actually faster. And that's really baked down to when and why you should use a workflow. One of the main benefits that we've talked about previously in other webinars is the key benefit for a workflow is to ensure that the correct reviewers access the proof at the right time. So you're not inviting someone into the proof too early before they can see feedback without context. And what we're seeing here is that this actually allows more people to contribute to the project, but allow that proof to stay on track and turn around quicker. So while we are creating more versions, more comments, and more decisions with the workflow, it's actually getting through that review cycle faster. One, it's eliminating the time where that video is waiting for someone to pick it up and add their comments because the workflow is automatically routing it. But two, it's also making sure that it's getting to your reviewers at the correct time, so they're adding appropriate comments based off of what other people have contributed. So creating that collaborative aspect. So while the core metrics are increasing, more comments, more versions, more decisions, and it may feel counterintuitive that that reduces the turnaround time, the precision that the workflow allows you in bringing in the right reviewers at the right time and staging it so that they're getting in there when they're supposed to after another group has reviewed it is actually leading to this massive reduction in turnaround time. We see this apply for static files. We saw this apply for digital work, but it really gets telling in extremely complicated projects like video projects. That's where we're seeing the workflow have the largest reduction in effort.
Yeah, I think that was probably the thing that jumped off when I was jumped off the page when I was creating these slides was, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't think, like you said, Will, it's totally counterintuitive that with the core the core metrics increasing, but yet such a dramatic time savings. And being able to turn around a project so much more quickly. It definitely does speak to the value of workflow. We see it also for web projects. So similar to video, we see an increase in a few of the core metrics. This one is actually twice as many versions, but also twice the number of decisions, which is interesting to me. So this is, so websites, microsites, and even web application projects really can benefit from a workflow approach to the review and approval. So web projects which utilize workflow actually see a 45% reduction in turnaround time. And on that scale, that's an average of 9 days worth. So you're almost, you're basically almost getting 2 work weeks back of time. And, the thing about, getting this time back from workflow, as Will likes to say, like I've mentioned before, these kind of things compound onto each other, right? So, this is time that you can then get back to work on the next project, to work on, strategic, business building projects, but really almost close to 2 weeks of work week time saved. Really, I mean, that's tangible cost savings at the end of the day. So yeah, I mean, video, and again, I mentioned at the top or at the beginning of the call that website data was kind of interesting for web type of projects. It was really interesting. I think we have one more example where that kind of sticks out as well that we'll get to. There's a couple of key takeaways on workflow, and we're going to do kind of a larger takeaway section at the end of the presentation. But I felt that workflow was so impactful. I wanted to maybe just do a couple of key takeaways just on workflow. More people and collaboration. And collaboration, I will kind of mold together as, comments and decisions. And that doesn't always mean longer project delivery timelines. So, as Will mentioned, making sure that the right people get the creative at the right time in the process. With those proper guardrails in place, stages, time, and/or decision-based triggers, automated notifications and reminders, workflow can really help manage those larger team review and projects. So I think it's a really important piece to kind of reiterate here. And even with 2 or 3 times the amount of versions, comments, and stakeholders providing feedback, delivery timelines can actually be accelerated, which I think we just showed. And I know this is the point I just kind of made at the end of the last slide, is that actual days saved, they're compounded across team members, right? So it's like 9 days. But how many team members did you have on the project? Is it 9 times 5 people days? That's a lot of people days to get back for future work, and that's real tangible opportunity cost dollars right there. Not only is it hard cost, but it's also opportunity cost. Could you take on more projects? Could you secure a new client with the time saved? Possibly. Could you take on next quarter's projects, starting them a little bit early? Sure, possibly. So for our last section, we wanted to look at time is precious, and so are timelines, and we wanted to see we wanted to look at timelines and some contributors to why turnaround times are what they are. So first is a question: do more stakeholders lengthen projects? And I hate this answer, but it depends. I think what we just showed, for example, video projects. The video projects sit within averages for versions and comments made on those versions, but have the longest average turnaround time of 65 days. That's the average. That starts to contribute to that number that we'll just walk through as far as the time saved against workflow, or when you utilize workflow. I think the video specifically, this could be due to, I should say probably, due to the extensive post-production work that's required between versions, especially if you require a reshoot or touch-ups, which are typically done, by hardcore video editors. There's some time required in between. So I think that is probably what contributes the most. And kind of going back to the web example, and the other way of looking at it is the media format with the most comments on average. So that'd be live website captures, and we'll look at the raw data in just a second. Those projects, that media format, live website captures, actually has the quickest turnaround time. So, and I asked that question a little bit earlier, is perhaps those projects have the most urgency, or another way of looking at it is they might be the easiest types of projects to knock down and to complete. So, like I said, I don't necessarily think that more stakeholders or more comments necessarily impacts the a project turnaround time. So let's look at the raw data in this case. The box is shaded in blue, just to kind of orient yourself in this sea of numbers, this eye chart of numbers. The box is shaded in the blue are the highs for each category. And I shaded the live web capture data that we just talked about to call that out, just as a secondary example. I found it interesting that static web captures and live web captures have significantly different stats. I don't really have a good explanation for that myself, but I'd welcome anyone's thoughts on that in the chat or Q&A. Actually, that was something that I just kind of noticed as we were about to go live here. So Will, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that off the top of your head, why static or live are so divergent?
Yeah, I think it actually comes down to the enhancements that I think it comes down to the actual enhancements that live website proofing gives you. And this is one of the critical aspects. We talk about it. We talk about it a lot in other webinars where as you're evaluating online proofing tools, you want to make sure that they can handle things like a live website review. A lot of digital work is interactive. There's things you click, there are pop-ups, there's hovers, there's drop-downs, and a static web capture really doesn't capture that for you. It doesn't allow you to see that. So where you see that is people need to ask more questions on the comments. What does this do if I click here? What should happen here? And it also allows for, tying back to what we said earlier, a static web capture is great if it's a single page, like a microsite or a blog. But once you get into actual website, then you have more richer digital elements to it. And if you can't represent that in a live website, then you start introducing more questions and less precise feedback. So that's why we always really recommend using the live website feature. And if you're using an online proofing tool without live websites, you're probably going to see that increased comment and version and turnaround count because you can't give as precise feedback.
Yeah, that's a great point, Will. That's a really great point. And I think it's not to talk too much just specifically about Ziflow as a product, in the webinar, but that is a big differentiator for ours as our clients who are, as you mentioned, Will, running, large website projects that, they want to check the interactivity of it, but also they want to go more than one page deep to maybe, follow maybe perhaps a product story or a narrative or the buyer journey to make sure it's all of a consistent experience. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the other thing, the one thing that there's a bunch of things that if you look at this chart long enough, you can start to draw conclusions on. Video, we've come back to video quite a bit on this webinar. But you look at the comments per project and the versions per project, all very well within average. And then you look at decisions and turnaround time. Obviously, I think that speaks to not only the complexity but also the work that goes into video projects. And then there's a good old audio at the end of the chart. Barely a comment per proof or per project, I should say, and just a little bit over a version. But yet still, very important to those who traffic in that type of project. Let's see, I believe actually now that we've tortured you with these numbers and my computer actually just froze. Oh, wow, that's what happens when you put a ton of numbers on your screen. Let's see, there we go. Let me go, okay, so I wanted to, sorry about that. I wanted to look, I want to actually turn the phone over to Will. Since we tortured you with these that number chart that froze up my screen, I also wanted to look at some outliers. We wanted to look at some outliers. So we found some fun facts from our research, some really big numbers. I wanted to have Will walk you through these before we get into our kind of summary.
Yeah, absolutely. So a fun fact, I always like to look at these and say like, okay, what's the biggest numbers we have? Now, some of these are crazy. The highest comment count in our approved proof, so total number of comments it took to get approval, was actually a little shy of 1,300. That was in about 6 versions. So they were averaging about a little over 200 comments per version. So if you ever think that your design team or your copywriters and editors are giving you way too much feedback, there are definitely some reviews that are going in there and they're getting upwards of 100, 200, 300 comments per version of the proof that they're putting out. So we see a large number of comment counts, the largest one being almost 1,300 comments. The most versions we saw in an approved proof is 73. So from beginning to end, from very first version to final version before approval, it took them 73 versions. Across those 73 versions, they recorded about 700 decisions. So averaging about a little less than 10 comments per version. Now, a couple of really interesting things here is the average turnaround time per version for this project was about 4 days. So it's still extraordinarily quick turnaround time as they're going through the full review cycle, adding their comments, capturing those comments, submitting their decisions, getting it out to a production team to make those changes, kicking off that new version. A couple of really key things I do want to point out is we're all three of these, if you're wondering, were workflow projects. So all three of these definitely took advantage of the automated workflow to keep track of this high comment count, large number of versions, and big number of decisions. And where we're really seeing these large numbers is when it comes down to marketing compliance projects. As you have to get brand compliance or regulatory compliance, we're seeing the number of comments, versions, and decisions go up because you want to make sure that you're capturing the right things. But as Mike and I talked about earlier, even though we're seeing these huge numbers on versions, decisions, and comments, counterintuitively, turnaround time is still shrinking because the workflow is allowing it to push through and stay on track and move the projects faster. So just want to touch on some of the fun facts. If you're ever complaining about your designer giving you too many comments, well, at least they're joining a really great group and getting up there on that high comment count or decision count. But you can rest assured knowing that all the comments, all the decisions, everything's being logged and tracked and will be available for audit purposes in the future.
As I mentioned, we are going to make a copy of today's presentation available to everyone. So please feel free to print out just this slide and put it up either in your office or in your cube or in your home office to maybe make yourself a little bit better about when your project maybe creeps into version 4 or version 5. Those are some great stats, Will. Thanks for sharing those. That is always a fun part of doing this type of research is to sort highest to lowest in Excel and just look for the horror stories. So that's great. I think that actually, yeah, that takes us toward the end of today's presentation. I want to just cover a few key takeaways. We've got a few Q&A questions in the Q&A box. While I cover these takeaways, please feel free to jump into the Q&A and ask your questions. I think at a high level, obviously not all projects are created, not all projects, I should say creative projects are the same, but a consistent system and process for reviewing and approving those assets obviously is incredibly beneficial. More reviewers, contributors, and stakeholders. That doesn't necessarily have to mean longer project cycles. I think we covered that pretty well on today's call. As workflow can help you, but even without workflow, project timelines tie closely with the medium and the work being done in between versions. I think that's something to consider as well as you start to chip away maybe as improving on your version optimization as maybe a key. And one thing that we kind of touched on that I do want to kind of surface before we let you go today is that the time saved via automation, stage triggers, notifications, reminders, that is real tangible time. That is real time that you get back. And I think we demonstrated a couple of extreme examples of getting time back and how many people days you can basically reacquire by leveraging both workflow, but also the automation capabilities within workflow. And now that that means just more time spent on high value, creative, and strategic work. So I'd say those is kind of our key takeaways. As I mentioned, we're happy to share all this data. Everyone will be getting a copy of today's presentation and a recording of the webinar as well. At that point, I want to go ahead and open up the Q&A. I've got a few questions. I see just a couple of questions. Maybe that'll spur some other questions. But while I ask, and while we address these questions, if you're interested in taking a product tour, go ahead and go to ziflow.com/demo, and we'd be happy to walk you through workflow examples, but also how we might be able to help you optimize your review and approval process. All right, so with that, let's go to the questions. Just a couple here I see. Let me just minimize this window.
Yeah, and as Mike is pulling up the questions, one thing I do want to point out is as people look at benchmarks, they always inevitably compare themselves to it. So if you're noticing that your version count is much higher than the average that we're seeing within Ziflow, or you have way more comments, way more decisions, a much longer turnaround time, I would say, please feel free to reach out to the Ziflow team. With over a decade of experience, we know every trick and best practice under the sun on how to get the most out of your review and approval process and make it as efficient as possible. So if you are noticing that your turnaround times and your version counts are much higher than the benchmarks here, don't get discouraged. Please reach out to the Ziflow team, and we're more than happy to work with you to try to optimize your workflow.
I think Will was cheating and saw the first question, which is, does Ziflow offer examples or best practices for workflow? Absolutely. As Will just mentioned, we'd be happy to walk you through industry specific. Will touched on the area of compliance. That is definitely something that more and more of our clients are looking to demonstrate their control over their review and approval processes. And workflow is an awesome way to do that. So yeah, absolutely, we can offer examples through that. Just please do get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to kind of talk about your situation and share with what we've learned, as Will mentioned, and over 10 years of experience in this space. The second question, our last question actually, is I have a product question. Is there any limitation on who can provide comments on a project? Will, I'll let you answer that one. That's a good question. I think as we talked a lot about comments and decisions, may have arisen some questions about like who can actually provide those comments and decisions.
No, that's a great question. There actually is no limitation on who can provide comments and give feedback. That's one of the nice things of an online proofing platform like Ziflow. You actually can control for each reviewer, can they add comments, can they make decisions, can they add comments and make decisions. So as you're sending out your proofs to review, you get a lot of granular control over what each person's role is on that proof. As we're talking about reviewers on a proof, I think a fun fact that we missed, but is definitely worth pointing out, is the most reviewers on a proof. The most reviewers I've ever seen on any individual proof within Ziflow was 670. So you can have as many reviewers as you need on a proof as well. So if it's a large scale project and you need a lot of people to see and provide feedback, you can definitely throw hundreds of people for that review. And for each reviewer, you can give them their own unique permissioning.
Wow, yeah, I may add that to the slide in post-production then, Will. That's an amazing number. It's an amazing number. Yeah, so that actually is our only two questions. I want to thank everyone who attended today. Thank you for asking your questions as well. If you'd like more information, you can reach us at ziflow.com. And as I mentioned before, we'll be in touch a little bit later today, maybe this evening, with a copy of today's presentation. So that does it for us. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for joining, everyone.